Good evening. Thanks for joining us today for a conversation with David Michael Pritchett, author of Mossback: Ecology, Emancipation, and Foraging for Hope in Painful Places. I'm Stephanie Mortis-Stevens, Acquisitions and Project Editor at Trinity University Press, and I had the pleasure to work with David on Mossback. Trinity University Press is a nonprofit cultural and educational publisher, and we are committed to an evolving agenda of work that engages, questions, and brings us together productively, in person and online, to discuss the world around us, both the natural and built elements of that world, and how it shapes us individually and as communities. To those ends, we hope you find some substance and enlightenment in this discussion tonight. In Mossback, David traverses geography, history, and genealogy to explore landscapes and mythologies at the intersection of environmental, indigenous rights, and social justice. This collection of a dozen essays traverses various types of terrain, from the heart of a swamp to the modern grid lines remaking our watersheds, across the tracks of the animals who share this earth, and deep into the inner landscapes of the soul, to find glimpses of light in dark places and hope in painful legacies. Joining David this evening is Kamea Chayne, an alternative media creative who was born and raised in Taiwan with a Hakka Taiwanese cultural upbringing and influenced by Taoist and Buddhist philosophies and practices of land and ancestral veneration. Kamea is the podcast host of Green Dreamer, which explores our paths to collective healing, biocultural revitalization, and true abundance and wellness for all. She also publishes Uprooted, a reader-supported newsletter exploring counterculture perspectives on all things, countercultural perspectives on all things related to our planetary health. You can order Mossback at tupress.org using the link in the chat screen and get a 20% discount using promo code MB20 at checkout. And now, please welcome David and Kamea.
Hello, thank you so much, Stephanie, and everyone else at Trinity University Press, and thank you so much to everyone who is here with us. I'm really honored to moderate today's discussion, and I'm excited to introduce you to the author of Mossback, David Michael Pritchett, who writes about land, ecology, settler colonialism, and the recovery of story and myth. David works in emergency medicine, and he holds a diploma in mountain medicine and is certified in track and sign. We'll get to learn a lot more about David and his inspirations and learnings throughout this conversation, but I wanted to share a quick reminder that this is an open discussion. So if you have any questions for David at any point, any follow-up questions to things that we're already discussing, please do feel more than welcome to send them in through the Q&A function. And yeah, we'll do our best to weave them into our conversation throughout our time together here. I also wanted to mention real quick that I have a little bit of a sore throat, so don't be startled if you see me drinking a lot of water throughout our conversation or having to pause and slow down while I speak. But for now, David, hello, and thank you so much for your invitation for me to join you here for the exciting celebration of your book launch. It's truly an honor to be in conversation with you.
Thanks, Kamea. Yeah, glad to have you with me.
Of course. So whenever I personally host interviews for my podcast, I always really appreciate first getting to know a little bit about the featured guest's roots, background, and key inspirations, because I think they help us to calibrate our own unique lenses and better understand where their speakers are coming from and how their perspectives have been shaped. And throughout Mossback, you share various personal and ancestral anecdotes about yourself. Like in the chapter Thinking Like a Mountain, you write about your upbringing as a white American growing up in Kenya, Or in another chapter, you address it to your ancestor, Captain Ware, sharing how you're contending with the legacy of your ancestors. So I wonder if you can first give us a glimpse into your upbringing that really compelled you to sit with the difficult questions around power dynamics, hierarchy, and white supremacy. And yeah, share about your motivations to include these stories about yourself and your ancestors in the book.
We'll just start with the easy stuff, huh? Yeah, I grew up in Kenya. My parents were missionaries. So that was the backdrop to my childhood. And yeah, more recently, I've spent time, yeah, really paying closer attention to both the natural world around me, but also the legacy and genealogy that yeah, that my own unique story has. And so yeah, I knew when I wanted to write this book, I wanted to find some way to combine both my love for learning about the places that I've lived throughout my life, but also take seriously the legacy of what it means to be a white person in this place and time. And yeah, and so in my chapter where I write a letter to my ancestor, that's where I really try to grapple with a lot of those things. Yeah, what does it mean to have a legacy? Yeah, of having an ancestor who owned slaves and who colonized new lands in Texas. Yeah, they're hard things to sit with, and I don't have easy answers for it. But I do think that doing that deeper history is important work to do, because if we don't know our stories and know how we've been shaped by the historical circumstances that have brought us to where we are, then I don't think we can change it.
Yeah, I really appreciated getting to kind of read through the difficult questions you've been sitting with and attempting to understand the decisions that your ancestors made, but at the same time recognizing that there were a lot of detrimental impacts from those decisions as well. So yeah, like you said, there are no easy answers. It's important to sit with all of these difficult and conflicting realities. And we can't talk about your book, of course, without talking about the meaning of the word mossback, which, to be honest, it was a term that I hadn't personally engaged with before. So I would appreciate it if you can shine a light on the meaning of mossback and your key inspirations to want to reclaim the word.
Yeah, again, I like to think a lot about how to live well in the places we inhabit, and also want to do so in a way that takes seriously responsibilities that we have, and particularly for me as someone with a lot of social privilege, how can I do that? So I was looking for metaphors for that, and I can't honestly remember how I came across the term, but I was thinking, I came across the etymology of mossback, and I'm kind of a word nerd, so I like to think about where words come from. And so as I was doing some of this research, I found that a lot of people think it was sort of analogous to the term redneck, we use for people who are living in the sort of backwoods swamps of the Carolinas in the early colonial days. People who were, sort of so backwards and slow moving that moss literally grew on their backs. But then as I learned more about this term, right, I found that it's a term that was used for people who were deserting the Confederacy, the Confederate Army during the Civil War. They were called mossbacks. And it was later a term, I found one instance of the term where it was used by in a report to Congress during the Reconstruction period by this sergeant who talked about this group called the Mossybacks or Mossbacks, who were fighting the KKK in Northern Alabama. So it's this word that has this rich layered meaning. And of course, there's the more obvious like meanings of mossback as like a turtle or a fish that's big and slow and has algae growing on its back, right? And so there's also that sort of ecological symbiont meaning of it as well. And so this layered history of the word that I love, that sort of can include and encompass all these meanings of both people that are like really tuned into their place, but also who, are not going to fight elites, rich people's wars, and who might have something to say about systemic or interpersonal racism in their communities.
Yeah, I really love this visual and this idea of somebody who moves so slowly that they're able to be really in tune with their surroundings and the dynamics and everything going on around them. So, yeah, I really love all of these layered meanings. And throughout my past interviews, I've been really called to dig deep to look at different words and be critical about certain words. And I would say for me, some of the most pivotal ones have been the words nature or wilderness, where, nature is formally and officially defined, if you look in the dictionary, as I'm paraphrasing here, but basically humans and everything. No, hold on. It's everything other than humans and everything that humans create. And then the term wilderness suggests that there's this pristine place absent of human influence and human communities. And both of these terms, nature and wilderness, in their primary uses, reinforce worldviews of separation, which are not culturally universal. And they also have been weaponized as the basis of displacing indigenous and land-based communities in the name of quote unquote wild wilderness or wildlife reserves or nature conservation. And also from what I'd learned from various indigenous scholars and leaders, in most indigenous languages, there isn't even a word for nature or the wild. It's just the world, the land, the earth, and being a part of everything. So from the influence of people like Mark David Spence of Dispossessing the Wilderness, Dr. Christine Winter, Farmer Rishi, and more, I've personally come to resonate more with the words disassociation or disorientation or disembodiment rather than disconnection in order to describe the cultures which have not learned to grow mutualistic and life-enhancing roots and networks in place. So when you talk about rootlessness in your book, it really reminded me of this, that it's not so much about whiteness not having roots, but there being a sense of disassociation from community and from place. And where I get stuck at, though, is when I think about how the colonial worldviews of this nature culture divide led to kind of the creation of systems that actually hinder people's abilities to be in tune with the ever-changing dynamics and seasonalities of the land. And so perhaps with an integrative worldview, it's not so much that these systems are considered problematic because they are, quote, unnatural or man-made, but perhaps it's more so just that they don't facilitate nor encourage the regeneration of diversity and life, when they kind of dull our senses and abilities to read and respond to the dynamics and symptoms of our landscapes. So with all of these thoughts lingering, I really resonated with your chapter titled The Watershed and the Grid, in which you point out how grid maps are indifferent to the contours of the land. I'd be curious to have you talk more about this idea of being more or less in tune with the dynamics and relationalities of the land through the grid or the watershed, and what lessons some of these historic and present day stories can offer.
Yeah, thanks. That's a big question, and I appreciate your insights on that. Yeah, I do think a lot about how, right, the idea of wilderness, right, is just like a place where I don't know how to live, right, is one way to think about it. And I agree with you. It's like it's a created idea. And so how can we learn to live in our place as well? And I want to give credit to where it's due. The idea of like the watershed and the grid, these are ideas that have come from me from my own like mentors and teachers. And so people like Ched Myers, who lives here in Ventura, people like Mark Lakeman, who's a teacher up in Portland, who is influential, and some others. But there's a long history of people mapping a grid over the landscape, which tends to hide the natural features of a landscape, and kind of makes it all the same, right? Like, if it's, I used to live in Indiana, and that whole state is covered by a grid system, and the grid itself doesn't pay attention to the topography of a specific place, right? Whether there's a river that runs through it, or hills, or forest, it's all under this grid system, which both facilitated historically colonization of that place. And there's lots of documentation of how, even as the surveyors were laying out the grid in the Midwest, settlers were jumping onto that land even before there had been agreements made with the indigenous peoples in those areas. So I think the grid is almost like a conceptual barrier that we have to encounter and overcome first before we can figure out how to best live in the places we inhabit, right? How can we think of our landscape not as a particular geometry, but rather, a place that's literally enlivened by the flow of water over the landscape, and the land, what Aldo Leopold called the land community that lives on it. And the grid, our maps of the grid tend to erase those features that are actually the living embodiment of what a landscape and a land community are.
Yeah, and I've experienced both living on grid and off grid, and I think when people live on the grid, it's a lot easier to take everything for granted and not really think about, oh, I just turn on the tap and here goes my water. So there's less of that sense of awareness of having to be in tune with, how much has it been raining recently? Where is my electricity coming from? How much electricity am I using? And is it compatible with what, my community generates? And all of these questions. And when people have to rely on catching rainwater or have off-grid systems, like they're forced to have to be in tune with that, because otherwise you're not going to be able to last till the next week and so forth if you aren't really in tune with these changing dynamics of the land. Part of your background is that you're also certified in track and sign, which I'm sure influenced your perspectives and curiosities and the lens that you've looked at a lot of these questions through. In the chapter Hungering Bodies, you write, "For all the attention that food ethicists and food activists give to what goes into our mouths, there's little consciousness of the other end of the alimentary canal, in the same way that the tracker looks at scat in order to more deeply understand a creature. In the same way that the tracker looks at scat in order to more deeply understand a creature, I similarly want to look at food and appetites in reverse. What can our excrement reveal about our food systems?" End quote. Talking to people with views that really deviate from the mainstream always encourages me to question again and again, like what advancement and progress mean. Because if we're not orienting them towards things like growing our vitality and meaning and diversity and fulfillment and just the richness of life, then what's the point of people having to work harder and longer hours just to collectively experience more stress and more strain and severances and insecurity? And this portion about paying more attention to our poop is really fascinating, because it also sparks this question of what so-called advancement in our food systems and our food waste could mean or should mean. I'm a caretaker of dogs and some other animals, and I do often find myself examining their poop to see how they're doing, but I've never thought about the question of what can we learn from analyzing our own excrements at a larger community and population-wide scale. You addressed this in the chapter, so I would love it if you can talk more about what your awareness of track and sign has led you to unravel about how different foodways impact the humanure of different communities.
Yeah. Thanks. I can nerd out about this stuff a bit, you know. Yeah, and track and sign and learning about animals, right? We often encounter these blobs of whatever on the trail or off trail when we're hiking, and you know, you can identify, you know, something is likely a coyote or fox scat because it's twisted and has hairs in it, whereas the scat of mountain lions or bobcats is harder, and it's a lot harder to find like individual pieces in it, right? So animals' bodies process food in different ways. And as humans, our bodies process food in particular ways, right? So we could think about this in lots of levels, right? I mean, we could certainly, and I'm sure people in the future will learn a ton about our society by, you know, not just our the excrement from our bodies, but just the waste in general that our society has produced. But we can learn a lot as well by looking at actually what's coming out of our bodies. And there's a lot of science around this, right? So one thing is that, you know, we're all connected. And so microbiologists have found that even in, you know, the deep jungles of the Amazon, when you analyze the human manure, you find that there's like antibiotic resistant bacteria, even in those, you know, what seem to be untouched places by civilization, quote civilization, you know. And so that tells me that nothing is isolated, right? There's everything's connected. Some other things we can learn is that you know, our diet is really bad for us. The American Gut Project is this big project that was this big study that analyzed people sent in their poop for, you know, however long, and they're analyzing thousands of people's excrement, and what they found is that the healthiest people, who they're determining by people kind of answering questions on surveys around their health, are people who have the most diverse diet. So the more different kinds of fruits and vegetables that you eat, that has a positive impact on your health. But that's complicated, right? Because we know that the people with the most access to a biodiverse diet are also the people with the most wealth. And that's not an accident. You know, we know about food deserts in urban areas. And so, yeah, and so it's really complex. Like, how do we change the system so that everyone has the opportunity to be more healthy? Yeah, lots of people write about this all the time, and I don't have all the answers, but it is interesting to me that, yeah, that looking at it from the back end, so to speak, kind of is revealing of a lot of things.
Yeah, and certainly the questions of injustice and access to a rich diversity of foods, that's something that we always have to hold front and center in these conversations. Also, just looking at your portion of your book about this, I just thought it was really interesting when you mentioned that an analysis looked at the microbiomes of 4 Nepalese indigenous groups, and they represent different food practices on a gradient from mostly foraging to long-term farming. And what they found was that the group that had been farming for the longest time had the least diversity in their microbiome compared to the group that still actively practiced foraging as a part of their foodway. So, yeah, I think a lot of people tend to see of course, this looks different everywhere because the food systems everywhere are different. Like some places are um, more compatible with farming practices, some places aren't. So there's of course that nuance there. But a lot of times people look at things like hunting and gathering and foraging as being really backwards or quote unquote primitive. I'm saying all these in quotes because those words have to be unpacked as well. But yeah, when we think about how having diverse gut microbiome is supportive of our collective well-being, it also raises this question of what does a healthy food system look like, and is what we've been considering an advancement of our food system really an advancement? Or if we analyze it not through the lens of yield and productivity per se, but through the lens of diversity, what does that tell us about the direction that we're headed? So just
Yeah.
a lot more questions to raise. And yeah, I really appreciate your book and how a lot of it is about encouraging different ways of seeing. And I recently wrote an article titled Diversifying Anthropocentrisms, in which I propose that there's no one such thing as anthropocentric because people have culturally defined the human and the role of what it means to be human differently. The same way that I know people are pushing back against the label of anthropogenic climate change because it's not universal. It's a subset. It's a specific group disproportionately contributing to the climate crisis. And so using the word anthropogenic, people contend that it kind of dehumanizes the many other people who have actually been regenerative forces in their communities. So in this scenario for anthropocentrism, I think a lot of people use anthropocentric or anthropogenic with negative connotations by default. So I kind of have rejected that. And for me, people being anthropocentric with our impacts is just a given because of the unique role and vantage points that we hold as human beings. So instead of trying to transcend my sense of self, I was more curious to diversify what anthropocentrism could mean. And on a
Yeah.
similar note, I also brought up this thought that there's no one such thing as an ecocentrist consciousness because every more than human being and community have their own agencies and are constantly co-creating and co-transforming their terrains and their extended bodies. So yeah, I've pushed back against this binary of anthropocentric versus ecocentric because for me, it's more about how one sees the role of the human and also how one understands the constant co-influence of all of life. And I personally had a difficult time articulating this, but I want to read a passage from your chapter, Finding Our Way Home, which speaks to this. So you say, scientists have proposed niche construction as a theory to understand the relationships between individual species and ecosystems, a relationship long known by indigenous wisdom and merely lost to Euro-Americans. Niche construction asserts that species create the environment most suitable for them. For instance, chaparral ecologies set conditions amenable to wildfire, since many of these species benefit from natural fires sweeping across the landscape, bringing nutrients into the soil and eliminating competitor species. Lemon ants in the Amazon use formic acid as an herbicide to remove plants unsuitable for their habitation. Beavers create dams to produce larger wetlands, which in turn lead to more riparian tree beavers. Mo- Sorry, I may have quoted this incorrectly, but yeah, just beavers create more dams that augment and expand wetlands, which then furthers that sort of habitat that is most suitable for them. And in a different part of the book, I think when you talk about rootlessness, you mention how the roots of whiteness may be allelopathic, which refers to a species altering its surroundings to make them less hospitable to certain other forms of competing life, while making them more hospitable to the species and community configuration that they personally rely on. And so when I piece these things together, I wonder if these niche constructions and agencies of all beings can also be considered metaphorically allelopathic in a sense. And yeah, I'm curious what you think of that and what more have you thought through in regards to this idea of the inevitability of anthropogenic change and the multitude of things that that can mean and represent. I know it's
Yeah.
a lot there, but
That's a
whatever
well,
comes
that's
to
a good
mind for
question.
you.
Yeah, I mean, I think I go immediately to I live in California, and right, we know that California was one of the most biodiverse places, certainly in North America, prior to colonization. Still is really diverse, but I think its biodiversity is tied to the indigenous peoples who lived here. And even now globally, right, we see that the most biodiverse places are typically the places that still are inhabited by indigenous people. Yeah, so I guess that tells me that like people can create positive and diverse places. Yeah, and yeah, so how do we learn to do that again, right? I don't know. I was thinking of the other day about I was thinking about ants, right? Because ants have been farming fungus for like millennia, and have figured out a way to do it that doesn't seem to destroy their landscapes like humans seem to have done with a lot of our farming practices. And ants have also been shepherding aphids, right, to basically eat from their excrement also for millennia. So they've had these like practices of both farming and you could almost say like domestication or animal husbandry of aphids for for millennia. And what could we learn from their practices? How might we farm in ways that are sustainable or even contribute to the biodiversity of the places we live in? Yeah, that's where my mind goes. I don't know.
Yeah, thank you. And actually, we have two questions from our audience that I want to bring in. Heather asks, how does wealth become one, a barrier, and or two, a tool towards re-embodiment? That is reconnection to roots, land, each other, and so forth.
Yeah. Gosh, Heather, bringing the hard questions. Yeah, I'm gonna have to think on that for a little while. Maybe we can go on to the next
Yeah.
one.
Yeah. Okay, so the second one is, how would healing our quote gut brains impact us on an individual and collective level?
Yeah. That's a great question too. And that kind of goes back to what we were talking about with our guts and microbiome. Yeah, I don't know. I don't know if like healing our gut brains will create liberation, but I do think right, I do think it's important to acknowledge that we are symbiotic beings. We depend on these tiny animals, right? One microbiologist, Shiv Watkins, calls them the smalls, and we depend on them. We couldn't function without them. And so that's just a reminder to me that we depend on all these beings around us, and can't live even without these small beings who can't even see.
Yeah. Yeah, and when everything is entangled, I think it would be very difficult for one person individually to heal and diversify their microbiome without taking a look at this in a much more big picture and systemic manner, so that it is ultimately about collective emancipation and liberation and not just healing one individual body, because that body is tethered to the extended bodies, tethered to other bodies, and everything is entangled, so yeah,
Yeah,
it's hard to look at things at a
yeah, it's interesting,
solely
right?
individual level.
There's these studies that show that families share pretty similar microbiomes. If you have pets, your microbiome is influenced by them, and so it's this like ever rippling outward, overlapping circles of how our microbiomes are impacting ourselves, but also the people around us. So yeah, you're absolutely right.
Right. Yeah, like you mentioned earlier, there are antibiotic resistant microbes in places where they're probably not using those antibiotic drugs. So it's there, yeah, there's no separation. Everything is implicated in everything that happens.
Yeah.
And yeah, back to the first question, if you have any thoughts on that. Otherwise, we can come back to it later as well if
I might have to come back to it later. Do you have any thoughts on it?
Yeah. I think the first thing I would say is that first of all, it depends on how one defines wealth. Because there are very like reductionistic ways of defining wealth based on the monetary currency, or there are also a lot more holistic and encompassing ways of defining wealth as something that includes like our relational wealth, our social capital, our community, just including all of that. So I think if we reoriented wealth and what we grew as wealth, then it could be a tool towards re-embodiment. But if we excuse me, if we defined wealth in a very reductionistic way and try to grow that number at the cost of everything else, then it does become, number one, a barrier to reconnection, re-embodiment, and so forth. I'm sure there's a lot more to this, so I don't want to oversimplify, but that's what comes to mind for me.
Beautiful. Thanks.
Cool. But yeah, you're welcome to add to that, or we can come back to this later as well. My next question for you was that throughout the book, something that really stood out to me was that you often deconstruct or dig up the etymology and roots of different words. I started to touch on some of these, but I'm curious, what are the common denominators here? As in, what do you think we can learn from unraveling and sometimes questioning or reclaiming or reframing language in this way? Rootlessness was an example that I brought up earlier. Deracinate is another word that you also look at. I'm curious what you have to share in terms of how they pertain to your views and questions about whiteness and how you've been contending with your the legacy of your ancestors.
Yeah. Well, you've already talked about wilderness too, which I also mentioned a little bit too, right? The idea of wilderness that sort of justifies historically and probably still has justified kicking indigenous people off their land in the name of preservation. So I think it's important to think through how we've come to use specific words. Even thinking about the word, even the history of whiteness, right? I was kind of looking back today at this historian Nell Irvin Painter who talks about how we came to this idea through the work of eugenicists in Europe, who decided that white people, Northern Europeans were the superior race, and then sort of constructed these quote scientific ways to justify that. And it's a long and convoluted history, but has radically shaped our world. So that's one thing I'm thinking about.
Yeah. We have another quick note from our audience here that I'm going to bring in. They said, quick note from Alaska to push back against the comments on biodiversity and where indigenous peoples thrive. Biodiversity increases with proximity to the equator. Biodiversity decreases with proximity to the poles. Many diverse, flourishing indigenous communities live in the Arctic and subarctic. So there's that remark. And then a question I'd love to hear you respond to is, what is the role of language and the music of language for you in these urgent social questions?
Yeah, thanks for your comment. And yeah, I'm not an expert on hardly anything. So I welcome conversation and pushback, of course. What is the role of language? As I've said, I'm interested in language and in poetry, right? I don't think solutions come from, I don't think data and statistics motivate us, right? Beautiful language and stories, I think, does. And I'm thinking about one word that I did some etymology on is the word learn, which is also related to the word lore. And so both of these words come from a Proto-Germanic word meaning to get knowledge. And then linguists suggest that they're both related to this Indo-European word lace, which means to track. And I love that etymology because I mean, that's what language is, right? Is us like following these tracks. And if we go back far enough, so much of it is connected. In particular, I love that connection between learning and tracking and story, because for me, you know, I learned so much through stories, and I learned so much through tracking about the non-human creatures that live here with me.
Yeah. Thank you. And just in case I was the one who made the comments about biodiversity, I want to add also that I like to use the word biocultural diversity because, you know, linguistic diversity, language diversity, culture diversity, biodiversity, I personally have learned to see them as one of the same whole. So, yeah, I would say that it's not so much comparing like how biodiverse the Arctic is compared to the tropics, but it's honoring like collectively also that diversity, like the diversity of ecosystems, the diversity at every single level, from the microbial level to the community level to biodiversity to language to culture to also the diversity reflected between and across different landscapes. So yeah, I'm sure there are examples of places where land-based communities have been displaced from their communities, from where they have lived, and aren't able to practice their conventional food ways, and therefore their health has been implicated as well when they're forced to import more packaged foods that are much less biodiverse in terms of what compared to the traditional food ways that they've had. I don't have one example right now, but this is a common theme that I feel like is prevalent across a lot of communities that have been displaced and forced to not be able to practice their land-based food ways. So wanted to add that in, but I'm sure there's a lot more to consider here as well. And I recently just interviewed Dr. Melissa K. Nelson, and part of her inquiry with what kind of an ancestor does she want to be has been to think about what she wants to interrupt and see come to an end. So what no longer serves us that should be composted. And that really struck me because I think when people think about ancestorship, a lot of this is centered on what we want to leave behind for future generations. And in another conversation, Dr. John Hausdorfer also made a distinction between the questions of what legacy do you want to leave behind and what kind of ancestor do you want to be? And that also feels like a relevant question to ponder here as well. In Mossback on page 76, you write, "What does it take to be a good ancestor? To be good kin after one's life is over starts with being good kin in life. And this for white settlers means dismantling the house that white supremacy built," end quote. We've talked quite a bit about how you've been contending with the legacies of your ancestors and what they left behind for you. But what else would you like to weave in here in terms of your other thought processes and learnings on how you want to leave the world, or what you want to see composted for our future generations?
Yeah, great question. Well, and I want to say too, I just want to add, I recently heard a conversation with Alexis Shotwell. I don't know if you know her. She's a Canadian philosopher. And she has this article that I wish I had known about when I was writing that chapter called Claiming Bad Kin, where she talks about, you know, our kin are the people that we often don't want to be associated with. And in thinking about, you know, today, in terms of whiteness, yeah, your kin are also the people, you know, it's important to think not just who you claim to be in association with, but also who claims you. and I've not done a lot, but I've done a little bit of organizing work around racial justice stuff. And I think it's something that white people particularly struggle with, because, right, like when we get woke, so to speak, right, then we want to talk about how we're so different from the the bad white people. But and lots of people have talked about this, but how, you know, that sets us up for really for failure, because the white supremacists are really good at claiming other white people as their kin, and getting people that are disgruntled for lots of reasons to join in their ideology and their ideas of how to change things. So I think it's really important for me as a white person to claim the white folks that I don't agree with as kin as well, so that hopefully we can start building a better world now and a better future for all people. But that I don't even actually remember what your original question was, but I just felt important to say.
Yeah, just this question of being a good ancestor and things we want interrupted and composted and ended so that they don't get passed on to future generations.
Yeah.
Lots of
In
things.
that chapter, I talked about my ancestor, Captain William Ware, and this cabin that's still there, that's his, that still stands, right? And for a lot of people, it's seen as this representation of the sort of like pioneer mentality, right, of going out and settling. But also, I know, you know, I imagine if you're an Indigenous person from that area, then it doesn't feel good to have that standing as this legacy of settler colonialism that's taken over your land. So how do we compost these legacies? I don't know exactly, but I think it starts with digging into our own stories, and being honest about being honest about what I have received from settler colonialism and white supremacy, and then working towards a world where everyone is more free. And that can get pretty abstract, right? There's not, you know, as Windleberry says, there's no large scale solution to large scale problems.
Yeah.
There's
Well,
small.
that cues in my next question for you perfectly, because I know that you've been keen on not being directive in terms of the takeaways that you hope your readers can have, but really just more about inspiring different ways of seeing. So, I would love for you to expand a little more on this intention to not offer prescriptive solutions in spite of all the injustices, pains, and crises at various levels that you've spoken to in the book. And before you answer, I want to let our audience know that we're coming near the end of our conversation. So if you have any final questions, make sure to drop them in the Q&A box now, so we can, hopefully get to them before we wrap up. But David?
Yeah. Well, I work in medicine, and in medicine, you know, a common way to think about it is diagnosis precedes prescription, right? So we have to know what we're trying to treat before we can treat it. That's a particularly Western way of thinking about medicine, right? But it's still, I think there's a lot of use there. And going back to that word solution, I was thinking about this today, right? In chemistry, a solution is something, I think it's been a while since I've taken chemistry, but a solution is something where, right, the solute is dissolved throughout the base solution that it's a part of, right? So it's homogeneous. And that's not what we need, because the world is not homogeneous. And I don't think we want it to be anyways, right? You know, from the perspective of physics, if everything is the same, then the world is dead, right? There's no entropy is, has happened, and matter is all the same. So I don't think there is one solution. I think there are provisional and local solutions. And I, for one thing, right, I don't have the authority to speak on solutions for any place really, but I think we have to figure out solutions together in the places we live.
Yeah, definitely. I really resonate with that because, yeah, I've really come to learn that there are no one size fits all top down solutions, because the dynamics of every community are so different. The challenges communities are facing, the biocultural diversities in different places, they're all different. So there's not going to be a silver bullet to being able to address the centuries of these cycles of violence and destruction that have happened. But we appreciate getting to think through these difficult questions with you, and getting to see some of, these thoughts that you've been sitting with as well, which aren't easy and encompass a lot. Encompasses history, the present, and the future, and everything. So thank you so much. We do have one other question, so we can take this before we wrap up. Would you please comment some about your research? What research processes propelled this writing? And are there discoveries you cut from this manuscript but look forward to developing in a future project?
Yeah, thanks for that question. My research, mostly I'm I want to be in my life a student of curiosity and wonder. And so I'm fairly well educated, but I tend to just research the things that are interesting and compelling to me. So, we've talked some about my research into word meanings, and I did some genealogical research for one chapter. And a lot of this book kind of just came out of conversations with amazing friends that I have who like to think about the same sorts of things. And I hope I honored everyone in the acknowledgements for that. But yeah, I'm really grateful to have friends who are willing to think about this stuff with me. Are there discoveries I cut from the manuscript? I don't know if discoveries. I've been reading a lot of the biologist and philosopher Andreas Weber. I don't know if you know Kamea, but his stuff is really exciting to me. And so my next writing project is looking at more at animal tracking and trailing from this sort of perspective of biopoetics, and how every living being, leaves a signature in the world, and how being attentive and paying attention can help us sort of stay